Hi! Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do something with no pattern, on the fly, no real instructions, well, other than I've made bags before. I gave away too much. So really, today I'm going to be making a MacBook Air case, cover, whatever you want to call it. That's right, I'm going to be making a MacBook Air case. This particular MacBook Air case is what I'm making or did make for my mother for Christmas. As mentioned, I am not using a pattern. I am doing this on the fly. I will, though, give you the pieces that I cut, or the cutting pieces, below in the description. This will at least give you a guideline for when you're cutting your pieces at home. Again, I made this on the fly, so what you see in the video might be slightly different. Of course, I will have everything written down for you. For this project, you will need, obviously, some outer fabric, some inner fabric, a machine that will hopefully quilt, 2 zippers, and the most important thing here is you will need some sort of foam interior that you're going to be quilting. I am using Pellon Flex Foam. If you can find something like Soft and Stable or some other sort of quilting or quilted padding. Now, let's get over to the sewing machine and get started. As you can see, I'm choosing a fabric that complements the rose gold MacBook Air I have, and these are the 2 zippers I'm using. To gauge how much foam I need, I'm literally just laying out my MacBook on top of the foam and cutting. Hopefully it all fits. This Pellon Flex Foam has a fusible web on one side, so I'm ironing the more important fabric, the outer fabric, down to this fusible web. This makes it slightly easier for the quilting process. Being fusible, I use lots of heat and steam. I'm a big fan of diamond quilting. Here, I am laying my ruler on the 45 to the fabric and using 1.5 inch spacing, marking here with my tailor's chalk. I use tailor's chalk because it's easy to get off with a damp cloth later. As this foam is fusible only on one side, I am cutting out the back panel and just pinning in place gently. Now, I have a professional Janome quilting machine, or quilting sewing machine, and I use a walking foot. There's a lot of layers. It all depends on the type of foam you're using. If you are using a heavy layers or lots of layers, or depends on the fabric you're using, I'm personally using rayon and cotton. If you are doing a thicker fabric, you may want to, or in my case as I did, use your walking foot. Using the walking foot makes things a lot easier, especially when you're sewing through all these layers. Just remember, you don't have to necessarily quilt on the diagonal like I do. I happen to like diagonal quilting. You could do free motion, you could do feathering, you could do anything you like. Just remember, this is going to be a protective case for your laptop, or in this case a MacBook Air. You do not want to have too much quilting that it compresses the foam. You want to be able to have some padding there, so if you do seem to bang it around in your backpack or your bag, that it is stable. I made this on the fly, just copying my own personal laptop, my MacBook Air. So if you have a different laptop, the sizes might be slightly different. If you are copying me and using a MacBook Air, I have the cutting dimensions listed below. Being that we've quilted, sometimes the fabric will shift slightly, so it's always good to square up one edge, as I have done. Now I'm just marking out where I need to cut with my tailor's chalk. With this, really the front and back sections of the case are the most important. And as you can see here, I've got a nice seam allowance all the way around. Now it's time to round the corners. We will need to round the corners. This makes it easier for putting the case together and adding bias tape. I used about a 2-inch circle. I love a serged edge. Particularly with lots of layers like this, it keeps everything nice, compressed, and together for sewing later. If you don't have a serger, you could always just use an overlocking stitch on your regular sewing machine, zigzag it, or take the chance and just not do anything with it. An important tip. You can serge on round quarters. It's a little more difficult, but if you don't want to do that or don't feel confident doing that, serge the square first and then round the corners. You will have to put a scant 1/8 inch seam on those corners to keep everything together though. Now I made bias tape for this project. You can either buy pre-made bias tape, or you can watch the video, I think it was for my Quilted Advent calendar, where I show you how to make bias tape. Triangle, triangle, happy triangle, sad triangle, cut sew, makes bias tape. Now I'm using coordinating bias tape. If you're crafty enough, you can make contrasting bias tape. Limits are over there. I quilted enough of the foam that I had a piece left over, to which I was going to make the pocket out of. This is a good tip. Always quilt more than you think you need, than having to quilt another piece later. Once the size of the pocket was decided, it was time to put the zipper on. Now, put the zipper face down on the actual pocket front and sew along that edge, making sure to leave about an 1/8 to 1/4 inch overhanging. Once sewn down, this is what you have, and since you've left that little bit of overhanging, when you fold it back and top stitch, voila, it encases all the raw edges. And there you go, raw edges nicely concealed. Now it's time to put this onto the front of the actual bag. I laid it right side up first, and then marked where I was going to sew across. I did it where the zipper teeth actually were laying on the front of the pouch. This way, when I flipped it over, I had a nice line there, drew a line across, pinned it down, and then did my stitching along that line. This creates a slight bubble to the pouch, so there's room inside. See, now once it's down like this, we're just going to sew along the edge there, making sure that the zipper pull is pulled out of the way so we don't get that into our machine. Last thing you want is a broken needle. So again, we're just going to sew along that edge. And once you've done that, you have the pocket secured to the front of the bag. Now we just need to trim off the excess. And I did test this. This pocket does hold things like the plug, headphones, a mouse. It's great. I dislike the word gusset, but it is the proper name for it. Gusset. You have to decide how wide you want your zipper to be, or how wide the opening is at least. So, I marked about 3 inches down from the top and put pins in. This would give me the place where the zipper would end and the actual gusset would start. Now it was just a matter of measuring from those pins along the bottom, pin to pin, and then along the top, pin to pin. The top being the zipper, the bottom being the actual gusset part. Once you have those measurements, you just make a small rectangle for the bottom part, serge, quilt, etc. So these are all the parts we have. Our bias tape, our front, our back, and the long skinny rectangle, which is the gusset, as shown here. Now, it's really time to make sure we assemble this properly. Now you just need to sew your zipper to your gusset using the measurements that you had, or I provided below. Pick one. Now we just need to add bias binding to those raw edges. So just take 2 small sections of your bias binding, cut them off, and then add them to the end. Now when sewing this, you're going to sew across so the bias binding has a fold towards the zipper, and then you're going to fold it down, as I'm showing here. Then you're going to pin and sew right along that edge, usually with about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch, so that you end up with something like this. All neatly encased, all those raw edges. Next, what we have to do is find the middle of the front at the bottom and the top, and the middle of the gussets for zipper area and gusset area. Once you have the middles of everything, you just have to pin those to the marked areas. I used pins. You could use chalk or marker, anything like that. This can take some time. I am using a mixture of Wonder Clips and pins. I find Wonder Clips slightly easier. Once everything is clipped in place, this is what you have. Now, it's time to go over to the sewing machine and sew along that edge using a 1/4 inch seam. Adding the gusset to the front and back panels can be fiddly. I will give you this tip though. Always put the largest, flattest piece against your sewing machine, flat on the sewing surface. This will make it easier to manipulate around corners. And there you go, all nicely sewn. Now, I will say going around the zipper itself was a little more difficult and can be a little stretchy, but that's okay. And again, once you do one thing to one side, you do it to the other. I will also say I used Wonder Clips here. You could use pins, but your pins may or may not bend because this is a lot of layers you're going through. If you have Wonder Clips, even paper bulldog clips or butterfly clips, those also work. As mentioned before, you use a 1/4 inch seam. I will say you may not be able to get your walking foot in like I didn't. Now the fronts and backs are sewn to the gusset. All we have to do is trim off some tape here. Now it's time to add the bias tape. I am adding it here to the flattest, largest part of the bag, which happens to be the back and the front. This way, it makes it easier when sewing on the machine. I'm using pins here. You could use Wonder Clips if you have them. Again, when adding the bias tape, use the tip I said earlier. Flattest part on the base of the machine and sew around. This might mean that you might need to sew things like the bias tape slightly blind, but that's okay. In the end, it makes it easier to roll over. And there you go. The bias tape is on. Now we just have to roll over and cover that initial stitching line. See, we're covering the stitching line. You do not want to see the stitching line. I have here pinned so that you don't see the stitching line. And it's just a matter of going around with, again, a 1/8 or 1/4 inch seam, depending on what kind of bias you've done. Go slowly if you need to. Now, I will say that I make my bias tape 2 1/4 inches. You could go 2.5. It depends how comfortable you are with adding bias tape to curves. If you would like to see a video of me making bias tape, different thicknesses of bias tape, and different thicknesses of bias tape for seam allowances, let me know below. That could be a good video. Once you have added the bias tape to each side, it's time to turn. Turn slowly. You might need to get a turning tool to get those corners right. So, there we go. Everything is finished. So you know what that means? It's time for a fashion show! So, there you have it. This really can be made for any sort of laptop. Again, I have a MacBook Air. My mother is getting a MacBook Air for Christmas. Shh, if this comes out after Christmas, I hope you like your bag. If it comes out before Christmas, then shh, don't tell my mother. So, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Hit the little bell notification down there so you get notified when my next videos come out, and don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you have any comments, please let me know. Like, was this shirt okay? Does my hair look a little flat? Should I bake some bread? Thanks for watching. Bye now.